So a Christian recently said to me in my live that it was okay that God commanded Joshua to go and genocide all the 5 Amorite kingdoms, as well as genociding Ai and Jericho. But it's not proper for man to go and genocide other people. But because it was commanded by God, then his genocide was all right. So it begs the question that if a military leader feels or thinks that God is commanding him to genocide people, then you would be okay with it. You see, when we was going over that on Wednesday in Joshua 9 and 10, I was appalled at the idea that this God not only killed the men who were running away from the battle, because in today's world, if someone is running from the battle and we take them as POWs, we provide food and medicine and water for them, to care for them, provide shelter and clothing for them. It seems that we have a better morality about warfare than this God had during the time frame of Joshua. But he justified it in saying that they did so and they was able to do so because of all the horrible things that they had been doing and worshiping idols and probably doing child sacrifice and probably sacrificing their women. Probably. We have absolutely no indication of what they were actually doing. There's very little we know about the Amorites and their religion, and most of their religion is more along the lines of the Babylonian, Canaanite, Akkadian, Sumerian religions. So the ideas of all these child sacrifices, well, everybody participated in child sacrifices at some point in time in their history, just as well as the Israelites did also. Everybody did something out of a ritualistic thing that compromises morality. But he said that their God said so, so it was perfectly fine. That all the men and the older men and the older women and the women and the baby girls and the baby boys that were all genocided in these cities, that it was okay. And he was perfectly fine with that. I find it quite disturbing that Christians or Bible believers would be so accepting of the genociding of people in the past. And maybe because it's in the past, they feel disconnected from it. But if it were to happen today, it was Christians who had problems with what happened in Guantanamo Bay. It's Christians who had problems with what was going on in Vietnam. It's Christians who had problems with all war criminals. Christians had problems with what they was doing in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. Christians had problems with this. And although Christians were also the ones perpetuating some of this as well, the Germans were Christian. So, but it's okay if they're Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or some other deity that they believe in, because this guy wants to purify the world of only the people that believes in him and his structure, his rituals. And even though I pointed out that the probability of, or the possibility, not probability, the possibility of Joshua even existing, of Joshua conquering these Amorite kingdoms, Joshua conquering Ai and Jericho, are an impossibility to have happened in history. Let me explain why that is so that you'll have a clear understanding. So as we went over these last 3 weeks of going through the book of Joshua, starting with the city of Jericho walls had been down in the 1500 BCE and were not rebuilt until around 800, 900 BCE. The Joshua story had to have happened somewhere between 1320 and 1280 BCE. So if there were no walls in Jericho, how did the walls come tumbling down? It's an impossibility. If the city of Ai had been abandoned since 1600 BCE and was not re-inhabited until around 400 or 500 BCE, how could he have went into the city of Ai and decimated it? It is more likely that the people who were living in and around the 4 and 500 BCE who wrote the Old Testament, most likely they knew of the ruins of Jericho. They knew of the ruins of Ai, and they imparted their own story to validate who they were and their lineage. Now, the Amorite kingdom is even more interesting because we do not have anything written about the Amorites until the earliest, which is at 2500 BCE, remarked upon by the Sumerians as a kingdom that was on the rise. These Amorite kingdoms existed up until about 1600 BCE, with its greatest height being around 18 to 1700 BCE, with the rise of Hammurabi and the Hammurabi Code. This code by which many believe that some of the ideas of the Ten Commandments and some of the laws and that you find in your Old Testament actually comes from the Code of Hammurabi, which is justifiable and could be a plausible theory because of the time frame that the Israelites are writing this story is after and during the Babylonian Persian captivity era, being edited during the Hasmonean dynasty. But the fact that the Amorites also died out around 1600 BCE. Yes, around 1600 BCE, the Amorites were absorbed most likely into the Assyrian and or Babylonian societies that then came up on the rise, and also into the Egyptian society, which was the conquering nation of the Levant in 1600 BCE, all the way up until about 1100 BCE, that the Egyptians controlled the Levant. This hillside area that these Amorite kings supposedly were dwelling in was under the vassal statehood of the Egyptians until they lost it around 1100 BCE. Prior to that, they did have a time frame where they were their own kingdom, as noted by the Sumerians and Akkadians. But by 1600, most scholars, the consensus is from most scholars that they were merely just absorbed into other neighboring societies as their kingdom began to fall. So since this happened around 1600 BCE, and the Moses Joshua story could not have happened until around 1350 to 1280 BCE, then the possibility of them warring against the Amorites becomes an impossibility. But confirmation bias and confirmation bias forces the Bible believer to accept these stories as true stories. It forces them to think that these stories had to have happened, that these kingdoms had to exist during the time frame of Joshua, during the time frame of Moses, in order for them to be able to say that their Bible is true. Because if they do not, then they have to admit that their Bible is false, that their Bible stories are not true stories, and that they're not allegories or things of that nature, but purely just myth and propaganda. But if they accept that, and Moses doesn't exist, and Joshua doesn't exist, then it never works out. Because without Joshua and Jericho and the prostitute Rahab, you cannot get the line of Jesus. Without Moses, you cannot get the line of Jesus. And so if they accepted the facts, these people didn't exist, and that their stories are all fabricated, then they would have to admit their Jesus is also a fabrication. And that they cannot have. They will not stand for. This is why we choose facts over myths, over allegories. This is why we choose facts over conscious dissonance. And that is why we deconstruct it. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.